Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter, the home of radical centrism, and the place for those of you who like your politics in colors other than red and blue. I am your host, Dan Sally. My co-host, Sean, is out today, and we wish him well. So, what happened last week? The alliance between Donald Trump and Elon Musk appears to have ended exactly as you could have expected, with the two hurling insults and accusations at each other from the social media platforms they own. In this war of words, Musk has become the latest in a series of partisan actors to suggest that America may need to look beyond the two-party system for real solutions. But some big questions remain, such as, will this have any meaningful impact? Is this feud even real? And if the answer to both of the above is yes, do we really want Musk leading the charge? We are going to dive into this today. But first, as always, I want to issue my weekly PSA thanking you for listening to this podcast and reminding you that if this is your second or third or fourth or fifth or 10th time here and you are still not a subscriber, please click subscribe. It'll ensure that you get the episodes as soon as they're released and will also make us more visible to other folks like you on podcast platforms. We really want to make this a source of information for those of us who feel left out of the two-party dynamic, and your support really helps. Secondly, if this is your first time here, welcome. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear today, be sure to subscribe and also be sure to tell anyone you think might need to hear this too. In the right numbers, we can have a real impact and your support helps. Now on to the main story, which is the feud that erupted between Trump and Musk at the end of last week. Now, before we get into this, I want to state something that I think is going to be relevant to this conversation, but also to other episodes we've had in the past, and no doubt episodes we'll have in the future, which is, I think a lot of the frustration that we have with the state of politics and the state of government in America is the idea that it shouldn't be this way. And I want to provide a counter to that, which is America's political system is working exactly as designed. It's not working well, but it's working as designed. And the things we see that we find the most frustrating are part of the way the system is designed. And if we're going to eliminate those frustrations, we really need to change the system. This will make sense as we move on in this conversation. But to get into the main story, I'm guessing you already know what happened, but just in case, I'm going to give you a play-by-play. So on Thursday, Musk tweets out, X's out, whatever it is, a critique of the Big Beautiful Bill Act. This is Donald Trump and the Congressional Republicans' budget bill that is making its way through Congress. And Musk calls it a pork-filled abomination and calls out Trump specifically for flip-flopping on fiscal conservatism. And over the next hour or so, Musk continuously attacks Trump and other Republicans for turning their back on reducing the debt, reducing the deficit. Now, the funny thing about this is all the while, Trump is sitting in a meeting with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and his Twitter thumbs are rendered impotent. So I can only imagine his frustration. Now, the meeting with Merz ends around an hour and a half into Musk's tirade, and Trump starts posting back on Truth Social about 20 minutes later, which is some unusual restraint for him. So +1 for personal growth. And he starts to say Elon was wearing thin in Washington and that Elon was mad that they cut the EV mandate. And then he begins to threaten to cut Musk's federal contracts and the subsidies his businesses receive. Then Musk claims that Trump was in the Epstein files, which, I mean, we all sort of knew anyway. So the whole thing kind of spirals out of control. Now, honorable mention before we move on, about an hour into this, Kanye West steps in to get them to stop fighting, which is really just, of course, what we all needed was Kanye involved. I would say the worst outcome of all this is that I had to unblock Elon Musk on X in order to read any of this. So now I'm back in the rabbit hole. But I think the first question we should all ask when looking at this is this real, or is this just another distraction? And I tend to fall on the side of this being very real, and I'm going to explain why. The first is, what would there be to distract from? Right now, Trump is polling relatively high. The Big Beautiful Bill Act is unpopular to those who have read it and or are paying attention, which is a very small percentage. And Musk also paid a fairly substantial financial price as the value of Tesla stock started to fall during this feud. So it doesn't seem like their interests are served in manufacturing controversy. The second part is that this is absolutely the most likely ending to a partnership between two megalomaniacs with no impulse control, multiple divorces. It's about as good of a match as a fork and a microwave. Now, the most interesting thing for me, big surprise, was Musk posing the question as to whether we needed a new political party to cater, as he said, the 80% in the middle. Now, last I checked, the poll had about 5.5 million votes on X, about 80% in favor of a new party, which of course carries about as much water with me as the 120% Putin received in his last election. But whatever, it shows there's a large level of support. But I think the bigger question is there any evidence that this will materialize in anything, or will this just be another instance of somebody exiled from Trump's political circle calling for an alternative to the GOP? And so, of course, I went back into history to try and see, are there any parallels? Interestingly enough, there are not. There are no direct parallels in history to this. But there is one instance that bears a striking similarity to where we are today. Now, there are definitely instances where presidents take on wealthy business interests. So, for example, Teddy Roosevelt very publicly took on JP Morgan in an effort to break up his monopoly over the railroads. In the 1930s, business leaders actually plotted to stage a coup against FDR, reducing his powers and installing a corporate-friendly leader who'd govern behind the scenes. Now, there are also instances where presidents had ethically questionable alliances with business figures. So, for example, LBJ awarded lucrative defense contracts to allies in Texas oil and aerospace industries. George Washington championed infrastructure projects like the Potomac Canal, which just so happened to boost the value of his land holdings in Western Virginia. But there has never been an instance where a president has had an ethically questionable relationship with a wealthy business leader or business leaders, and then had this relationship go south. So call it progress. Let's turn that frown upside down. But there was one dust-up between wealthy financial interests that led to a significant party realignment that is worth noting. And of course, if you've listened to this podcast before, you know if I've already talked about FDR and I've already talked about Teddy Roosevelt, the president we're going to talk about is Andrew Jackson. So, back in the 1830s, the U.S. money supply was controlled by the Second Bank of the United States. This was kind of an early version of the Federal Reserve, but it had come under fire for being a tool of Northeast elites. And at the time, the idea of a central bank was still kind of controversial. So kind of going a little further back in time, after the Revolution, Alexander Hamilton had established the first bank. And the goal there was to consolidate U.S. war debt and stabilize the U.S. currency. Now, it did that, and it also happened to enrich his fellow bankers in New York in the process. So that's another story. But the bank was eventually dissolved over concerns of federal overreach, and then the second bank took its place. And like Trump, Andrew Jackson was elected on this wave of populist anger that was driven by rural voters who really felt shut out of economic growth in urban areas. And they were very much driven by the same anti-elite, anti-establishment sentiments we see in the MAGA crowd today. So to them, the second bank represented everything they hated about the system. So when Congress approved the renewal of the second bank's charter, Jackson vetoed it. And he replaced it with a network of state banks who were politically loyal to him. So now this is very similar to what we're seeing today, which is a powerful president making a very controversial move that appeals to his anti-establishment base, but at the same time enriching his allies or empowering his allies. Now, this move actually alienated some of Jackson's allies in the Northeast who had close ties to financial interest, and it gave his enemies something to rally around. And this led to the formation of the Whig Party, which was a callback to a British party that had resisted royal tyranny. Now, Jackson's veto of the second bank's charter and his movement of deposits to state banks ultimately resulted in an economic catastrophe, which took place a few months after he left office. Great timing. Left his successor, Martin Van Buren, to take the blame. So this isn't an exact match, but there sure are a lot of parallels here. And I think it paints a picture as to what might play out should Musk decide to bankroll a third-party movement. So getting back to the Whigs, they were a coalition united against Jackson more than they were under any coherent ideology. And we've talked a lot on this podcast about how the modern day Democrats have really become more the anti-Trump party than anything else. Now, someone with Musk's resources could definitely fund a third-party bid that could potentially draw away moderate Republicans who are turned off by Trump, as well as independents who've either voted for Trump because they felt they had no other choice or against him because they felt he was the worst option. And so if we game this out, what we could expect is that any third party funded by Musk would ultimately force a realignment of the Republican Party around more than just a strong personality, but it wouldn't necessarily strengthen the Democrats, nor would it create any lasting political movement. And so to get back to my statement at the top of the episode, any third party bid would probably thwart Trump, but it wouldn't help give us a more diverse set of policy choices, and it wouldn't solve the problem of corruption within consolidated power. And I'm going to explain that last statement because if we go back to the founding of this country, the founders certainly believed in the concepts of liberty. They certainly believed in the concepts of democracy. And they certainly believed that their ideas of what liberty and democracy meant would and should evolve into, quote unquote, a more perfect union over time. That out of the way, the original republic, the original structure of the United States of America was more about how elites could peacefully transfer power minus a hereditary system that we had with the monarchy. And it did that very well. But it also served powerful interests at the time. And if you go back to the founding, we see instance after instance of political leaders using their power to enrich themselves or empower their allies. Again, we talked about George Washington. We talked about Alexander Hamilton. We talked about Andrew Jackson. These folks aren't the only ones. And this is a pattern that has continued over time. Now, we've refined the process. We have gotten better at sniffing out corruption. We've gotten better at eliminating cronyism, but we haven't perfected it yet. And part of the reason is that we still allow power to be consolidated under two parties. And what we're seeing today are two parties that in many ways are serving the same collective interests of economic elites. So in that sense, I don't see how a third party funded by the richest man of the world is going to do anything but provide another vehicle for elites to protect their interests. And I think we have to think beyond that, and I think we have to think systemically. And the way we combat this is by making power more difficult to hold. And the way you make power more difficult to hold is to introduce real political competition. So I'm recording this on Sunday, June 8th. Just yesterday, Andrew Yang said he had reached out to Elon Musk about potentially partnering on this party. I don't know if that's going to do any good, to be frank. I think unless you attack the issues that prevent either political party from having real political competition, that make it harder for new parties to form and challenge them. We're just going to keep repeating this cycle over and over again. And I don't generally take fear-mongering over another civil war seriously. I don't promote it. However, if we go back to Jackson, there was a collective series of political failures that followed that ultimately made it difficult for government to resolve issues. Eventually, that calcified around the issue of slavery and did result in a civil war. So a civil war is far from inevitable. Don't quote me on this, but I wouldn't even say it's in the top 50% of probabilities. But if we don't fix the issue of consolidated power under the two-party system, we could end up kicking the can down the road and be right there. So my over-optimistic hope in all this is that Musk, being a systems thinker, will take a look, will understand how the two major parties hold power, and will attack that. I doubt that's going to happen. And so what we need to do as citizens is we need to move towards acting reforms that can introduce real competition into the political system. If you've listened to this podcast before, there are a few I endorse. The first one, and one of the easier ones to introduce, is to implement open, nonpartisan primaries. Right now, one of the things that makes it easier for the parties to control power is the fact that the candidates that you vote for on the ballot are selected via a mini election that only includes the most partisan voters. So Democrats and Republicans vote for their favorite candidate, which is usually not in line with the majority of voters, and you have to choose between the lesser of two evils. Open nonpartisan primaries change that by requiring all candidates of all parties to compete for all voters. That gives all voters a choice in the candidate selection process and ensures that the folks that move on to the general election are actually appealing to the majority of voters they serve. Now, reform number 2 is ranked choice voting. One of the biggest problems that minor parties have is the spoiler effect, the fact that people feel that casting a ballot for them could spoil the election for the candidate they like the least. Ranked choice voting changes this by allowing you to rank your candidates in order of preference. So if your first choice doesn't win, you can throw your support behind your second choice, third choice, whatever. There's a hybrid of this being used in Alaska right now called Top 4. It's by far my favorite system. And the reason I like this so much is because it can be implemented at the state level and it doesn't require any fundamental change to the way we apportion congressional districts, doesn't require Washington to act, which is obviously a non-starter given they can't even pass a budget. Now, there are systems I like better out there. Now, Germany uses a system called mixed member proportional representation. I happen to think that is the gold standard. There is an organization called Fix Our House that's moving to implement that in the United States. If that can happen, fantastic. I feel, however, that's going to require a lot of lobbying. It's going to require a lot of effort from Washington. And I feel like these two other methods are far more feasible politically. So the tall and short of all this is that we're not watching any political fracturing per se. What we're watching are political and economic elites doing what political and economic elites do, which is going to battle when it protects their self-interests. And I think we need to think long and hard before throwing our support behind somebody whose brain is floating in a psychotropic cocktail of psilocybin, Adderall, and ketamine. Just a thought. We're going to cap it off there. If you liked what you heard today, again, be sure to rate this episode, write us a review, and if you haven't already, subscribe. The music you are hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.